In July 2001, 21-year-old Bryn Holloway was building the kind of life her family had always expected from her. Independent, disciplined, and closely connected to the natural world. She was a graduate student in environmental science at Oregon State University in Corvallis, studying changes in high-elevation ecosystems across the Pacific Northwest. Long before college, hiking had been part of her life. Her father, Warren Holloway, had introduced her to Oregon trails when she was still a child, and by adulthood Bryn had enough experience to understand both the beauty and the risks of traveling alone in the Cascades. Her mother, Celeste, never fully liked the idea of Bryn hiking by herself, but she also understood that preparation mattered more to her daughter than confidence alone. Bryn planned routes carefully, carried emergency supplies, checked weather forecasts, and usually told her family where she intended to go. Her younger brother, Nolan, had his own routine with her. Whenever Bryn went into the mountains alone, she sent him short updates whenever cell service allowed. It was an ordinary family habit, something neither of them had ever imagined would become important evidence. On July 14, 2001, Bryn drove from Corvallis toward Central Oregon and reached the Green Lakes and Soda Creek Trail area near Three Sisters Wilderness. Her plan was simple: complete a demanding day hike, collect observations connected to her environmental studies, and return before evening. Nothing about the trip initially suggested danger. Bryn had enough water and food for the day, basic first aid supplies, navigation equipment, extra clothing, and the usual items she considered essential for traveling alone. She had completed difficult hikes before. Three Sisters Wilderness was not unfamiliar territory to experienced Oregon hikers, but Bryn also knew that mountain conditions could change quickly and that even a routine mistake could become serious when someone was alone. During the first part of the day, Nolan received an update from her. Bryn mentioned that cell reception was becoming weak but gave no indication that anything was wrong. The message sounded so ordinary that Nolan had no reason to remember its exact wording at first. It became the final communication anyone received from her. As the afternoon passed, Bryn did not return when expected. By evening, there was still no contact. Calls went directly unanswered. Warren and Celeste initially tried to remain practical. Delays happened. Cell service in the Cascades was unreliable. A hiker might lose time because of trail conditions or decide to wait rather than continue after dark. But Bryn was not someone who casually abandoned a schedule without warning her family. When her Subaru was located near the trailhead with no sign that she had returned to it, the situation changed immediately. Local authorities were notified, and by the following morning Bryn Holloway was officially a missing hiker. The search expanded rapidly. Search and rescue volunteers were assigned to sections of the wilderness surrounding the route Bryn was believed to have taken. Experienced hikers and local personnel reviewed trail maps. Dog teams were brought in to establish where her scent might still be detected. Aircraft were used to examine areas difficult to reach safely from the ground. For the Holloway family, every hour created a new possibility and removed another. Warren provided search coordinators with information about his daughter's hiking experience, habits, and decision-making. Celeste supplied photographs and descriptions that could be distributed to volunteers. Nolan showed investigators the final message he had received. None of it revealed where Bryn had gone after her phone lost service. The first theory was that she had become injured somewhere beyond the main route. The second was that she had left the established trail for research or exploration and had become disoriented. As more time passed, the most feared possibility became increasingly difficult to ignore. Bryn might have suffered a fall in an area where rescuers could not easily reach her. Days passed without finding her backpack, clothing, equipment, or any confirmed sign that she was still alive. The operation continued because Bryn's experience made the absence of evidence especially troubling. An inexperienced visitor could easily take a wrong turn or make a dangerous decision. Bryn understood navigation. She understood preparation. If she had simply become lost, search coordinators believed there should have been some trace. On the seventh day, the investigation appeared to receive its first major break. Searchers discovered part of a strap from Bryn's backpack near a difficult section of terrain. The material was damaged, but investigators were able to connect it to the type of pack Bryn had carried. For the search teams, the discovery gave shape to the explanation they had feared from the beginning. Bryn might have fallen. If the backpack had been torn during an accident, she could have ended up far below a location visible from the main route. Rugged terrain could conceal a person even during an intensive search. The condition of the recovered strap seemed consistent with a sudden accident rather than someone intentionally abandoning equipment. The search continued, but no other part of the backpack was located. Bryn was never found. After 8 days, the largest coordinated phase of the operation ended. Smaller efforts and follow-up searches continued, while her family kept hoping that some overlooked detail would produce a different answer. Missing person information remained in circulation, and occasional reports from people who believed they had seen Bryn were checked. Nothing led anywhere. Months passed. Then a year. The explanation gradually accepted by investigators was simple and tragic. Bryn Holloway, an experienced young hiker who knew the Cascades well, had encountered the one combination of circumstances that experience could not overcome. The damaged backpack strap became the strongest physical evidence supporting that conclusion. For Celeste, Warren, and Nolan, there was no body and therefore no final moment that made Bryn's absence feel complete. There was only an unfinished investigation and a wilderness large enough to hold questions indefinitely. In 2003, 2 years after the disappearance, Bryn Holloway was legally declared dead. Her missing person case eventually became inactive. The emergency searches ended. Volunteers returned to their lives. News coverage disappeared. The Holloway family was left with photographs, possessions, records from the investigation, and the painful certainty that they would probably never know exactly what had happened on July 14, 2001. But the official explanation contained one fundamental mistake. Bryn Holloway had not died in Three Sisters Wilderness. The mountains had never taken her. On the same day, investigators believed an accident had occurred. Something planned long before her arrival had already succeeded. And the damaged piece of backpack that convinced almost everyone to search for a tragedy in the wilderness was not proof of an accident at all. It had been left there so that everyone would believe there was no reason to search anywhere else. By August 2006, 5 years had passed since Bryn Holloway disappeared in the Three Sisters Wilderness. For most people who had once followed the search, her name had become part of an old Oregon missing person case, remembered mainly by those who had participated in the original effort. For the Holloway family, however, time had never turned the disappearance into something distant. It had only changed the way they carried it. Celeste and Warren Holloway had eventually left Corvallis. Remaining in the family home became increasingly difficult because almost everything inside it belonged to a life that had stopped in July 2001. Bryn's room had stayed largely unchanged for years, filled with books from Oregon State University, outdoor equipment, notebooks, and ordinary belongings that no longer seemed ordinary after she vanished. Moving did not erase any of that history, but it gave Celeste and Warren a chance to live somewhere that was not organized around the absence of their daughter. Nolan Holloway had also moved forward in the only way available to him. He finished college and accepted work in Seattle. He built a routine, made new friends, and learned not to treat every unexpected phone call as a possible answer to a question that had consumed his family for years. The final message Bryn had sent him from the mountains remained saved, even though there was nothing remarkable in the words themselves. Its importance came entirely from what followed. Silence. The Holloways had accepted the legal declaration of Bryn's death in 2003 because paperwork eventually demanded an answer that the family itself never truly possessed. There had been no body, no confirmed location, and no final witness. There was only the damaged piece of backpack recovered during the search and the official conclusion that Bryn had most likely died in an accident. By the summer of 2006, that explanation had stood unchallenged for 5 years. Then, on the evening of August 23rd, everything changed. St. Charles Bend. The emergency department received a young woman whose identity was completely unknown. She had arrived without identification, a phone, money, keys, or any other personal belongings that could explain where she lived, or how she had reached the hospital. Her condition immediately suggested a prolonged period of deprivation rather than a recent emergency. She was dangerously underweight and severely dehydrated. Her clothing was badly worn, and her overall physical condition indicated that normal medical care and nutrition had been absent for a long time. More troubling were the old marks around her wrists and ankles. They were not consistent with one recent injury. Some had healed long before others, suggesting repeated restraint over an extended period. There were additional injuries in different stages of healing. The medical staff could not determine the full history from appearance alone, but one conclusion became difficult to avoid. Whatever had happened to this woman had not happened in a single day. The hospital contacted the Bend Police Department. Detective Elliot Vance was assigned to the case. At first, there was almost nothing to investigate. The woman was unable to provide a useful name, address, or explanation. She responded to basic instructions but offered little communication. She seemed especially unsettled by unfamiliar male voices, and ordinary choices appeared unusually difficult for her. Without identification, Vance requested fingerprint processing. It was standard procedure for an unidentified patient in suspicious circumstances. He expected the result might connect her to a previous arrest, an employment record, or perhaps an earlier missing person report. Instead, the database returned a name attached to a status that made no immediate sense. Bryn Elise Holloway, missing since July 14, 2001. Legally declared dead in 2003. The match was checked again because the implications were too serious to accept without verification. The prints matched the university-era records associated with Bryn. Old photographs from the missing person investigation were compared with the woman in the hospital. Age progression, facial structure, identifying details, and available records all supported the same conclusion. The unidentified woman at St. Charles Bend was Bryn Holloway. Bryn was alive. 5 years after Oregon authorities had searched the wilderness for her, and 3 years after the state had legally recognized her as dead. She had appeared in a hospital roughly 100 miles from the place where investigators once believed her life had ended. The first task was notifying her family. Celeste and Warren received the news the following morning. The information was so far outside everything they had been forced to accept that even confirmation through fingerprints did not immediately make it emotionally understandable. For 5 years, they had lived with one version of Bryn's fate. Now, without warning, that entire history had collapsed. Nolan was contacted in Seattle and made arrangements to return to Oregon. The family reunion did not resemble the impossible homecoming they had imagined during the earliest months of Bryn's disappearance. The daughter they remembered had been independent, academically ambitious, comfortable traveling alone, and confident in making her own decisions. The woman in the hospital recognized familiar names and eventually showed clear awareness of her parents and brother, but communication remained extremely limited. More disturbing than her silence was the way she seemed to wait for approval before doing even basic things. Food could be placed within reach, yet Bryn did not immediately eat. Water could be available, yet she hesitated to use it. Routine requests from medical staff seemed easier for her than making decisions on her own. When unfamiliar men entered the area, her distress became more noticeable. The response was consistent enough that the nurses began documenting it. The medical team initially focused on stabilization, nutrition, hydration, and careful evaluation of the injuries that had accumulated over years. But to Elliot Vance, the meaning of those injuries was already becoming clearer. Bryn had not spent 5 years surviving independently somewhere in the Oregon wilderness. Her condition was not consistent with a person who had simply become lost and somehow remained hidden. Someone had controlled her. Someone had restricted her food. Someone had restrained her long enough to leave layers of old marks. And whatever system she had lived under appeared to have continued inside her mind even after she reached a hospital. The missing person file from 2001 was reopened immediately. The old assumption of an accidental death could no longer stand. Every document from the original search now had to be reconsidered from an entirely different perspective. The damaged backpack strap no longer proved that Bryn had died. The absence of her body no longer represented a failed recovery. Even the location where the search had concentrated now had to be questioned. For 5 years, investigators had been trying to understand where Bryn Holloway had died. They had been asking the wrong question. Now there was only one question that mattered. Where had Bryn Holloway been alive? During the first days after Bryn Holloway was identified, the hospital became the center of two very different investigations. The medical team was trying to understand what 5 years of deprivation had done to her health. Detective Elliot Vance was trying to understand what kind of environment could have changed a confident 21-year-old graduate student into a woman who appeared unable to make even the smallest decision without permission. The answer began to emerge before Bryn could explain anything herself. Dr. Tamsin Keller, a forensic psychologist experienced in prolonged captivity and coercive control, was asked to assist. She reviewed the medical notes, the observations recorded by nurses, and the limited information available from Bryn's first days at St. Charles Bend. Keller immediately focused on patterns rather than individual symptoms. Bryn understood ordinary instructions. She recognized her family. There was no indication that she had completely lost awareness of where she was. Yet when ordinary choices were placed in front of her, she often did nothing. Food was one of the clearest examples. Bryn was severely underweight and required careful nutritional treatment, but the presence of food did not automatically lead her to eat. She waited. The same thing happened with water. Even when a drink was available and medical staff made it clear that she needed hydration, Bryn hesitated until someone explicitly indicated that she was allowed to have it. At first, some members of the staff assumed the hesitation was caused by fear, confusion, or the physical effects of prolonged malnutrition. Keller believed it was something more specific. Bryn was not simply afraid of making the wrong choice. She had been taught that making a choice was itself a violation. The pattern appeared again when she needed to use the restroom. Instead of communicating the need or going when she was able, Bryn waited until a staff member recognized the situation and gave her direct permission. It happened with speaking as well. Questions requiring a simple factual response were easier for her than open-ended questions. She could provide a word or short answer when specifically prompted, but spontaneous speech remained extremely limited. Even with Celeste, Warren, and Nolan nearby, Bryn often seemed to wait for some invisible signal that conversation was allowed. Sleeping created another concern. The hospital bed provided the support her weakened body needed, but Bryn repeatedly preferred the floor. Medical staff initially tried to encourage her to remain in bed. Keller advised them not to turn the issue into another struggle over control. The preference itself was significant. The bed represented choice and unfamiliar comfort. The floor represented something Bryn knew. Keller began building a behavioral profile from these details. She explained to Vance that prolonged captivity could change a person's relationship with ordinary decisions. If every act of independence had been punished repeatedly, obedience could eventually become a survival mechanism. After enough time, the person might no longer require an immediate threat to follow the rules. The rules would remain even when the person enforcing them was gone. That possibility fit Bryn with disturbing precision. She seemed to operate according to a system no one at the hospital had created. Do not eat without permission. Do not drink without permission. Do not move without permission. Do not speak unless someone allows it. Do not assume that personal needs create personal rights. Keller believed behaviors this deeply established were unlikely to have developed over a short period. They suggested years of consistent control. 5 years was entirely possible. That conclusion changed the direction of Vance's investigation. Until then, the central mystery had been how Bryn survived after disappearing in 2001. The original case had treated Three Sisters Wilderness as the location of the tragedy. Search teams had assumed that whatever happened to her occurred somewhere near the hiking route. Bryn's condition now made that explanation impossible. She had not spent 5 years wandering independently through remote country. Someone had kept her somewhere. Someone had controlled when she ate. Someone had decided when she could speak. Someone had created rules strong enough to follow Bryn into a hospital even after she was physically separated from the person who imposed them. The case was no longer about a missing hiker who had somehow survived. It was a kidnapping investigation. Vance reopened the 2001 file and began working from the most recent evidence rather than the oldest. Instead of starting at the trail where Bryn had disappeared, he started at St. Charles Bend. The immediate question was straightforward. How had Bryn reached the hospital? Available security footage showed that she had not arrived in a vehicle. There was no unidentified driver dropping her near the entrance and no evidence that someone had accompanied her. Bryn had reached the hospital on her own. That gave investigators something they had not possessed in 5 years: a direction. Police began reviewing available cameras around Bend, including recordings from businesses and major road approaches. The footage was incomplete. Many locations had no useful coverage, and several cameras were positioned for parking lots or store entrances rather than sidewalks or surrounding roads. But isolated sightings began to form a pattern. A woman matching Bryn's condition appeared at different points south of the hospital. The times showed gradual movement toward Bend rather than random wandering. Investigators extended the search farther south. The farther they worked from the city, the fewer cameras existed. At some point, the visual trail disappeared completely, but Vance now had a broad corridor rather than an entire region. Bryn had likely come from a sparsely populated area south of Bend. Property records were collected for isolated parcels that could reasonably connect to the route. Investigators were looking for places where someone could be held without regular visitors noticing unusual activity. Large rural lots, small farms, private access roads, and properties separated from neighboring homes received closer attention. Most could be eliminated quickly. Some had multiple residents. Others had regular employees or commercial activity. Several had changed ownership during the years Bryn was missing. One property remained difficult to dismiss. It belonged to Orson and Lenora Bellamy. Orson was 59. Lenora was 57. They had lived on the property for years and operated a small farm, selling produce through local markets. Their names produced no criminal history. There were no obvious reports connecting them to Bryn, Oregon State University, or the Three Sisters Wilderness Search. On paper, they appeared ordinary. That was precisely the problem. Nothing explained why Bryn Holloway would have any connection to them. Yet the Bellamy property sat close to the route investigators believed she had traveled before reaching Bend. The distance was possible for someone desperate enough to keep going despite severe exhaustion. Vance knew geography alone was not evidence of a crime. Many innocent people lived along the same corridor. The Bellamys could have nothing to do with Bryn. Still, after 5 years without a real lead, the investigation finally had something concrete enough to examine. Vance requested discreet surveillance rather than immediate contact. For 3 days, investigators watched the property from a distance. Most of what they documented supported the Bellamy's ordinary reputation. The couple maintained the property, handled routine farm work, and showed no obvious sign of criminal activity. There were no suspicious visitors and no unusual traffic. Then one detail began appearing repeatedly in the surveillance notes. Behind the main residence stood a large storage building. It was substantial enough to be useful for agricultural work. Yet during the entire surveillance period, neither Orson nor Lenora entered it. They worked nearby. They used other areas of the property. But that building remained untouched. For Vance, it was not proof. It was only an inconsistency. But Bryn's entire case had changed because investigators were finally willing to question things that once appeared ordinary. A legally dead woman had appeared alive. A hiking accident had become a suspected kidnapping. And now, at the end of a route traced backward from the hospital, there was an isolated rural property owned by 2 people with no criminal history and a building that no one seemed willing to enter. For the first time since Bryn Holloway vanished in July 2001, investigators were no longer searching for a place where she might have died. They were searching for the place where someone may have kept her alive. For 3 days, Detective Elliot Vance's team watched the Bellamy property without finding anything that would normally justify suspicion. Orson Bellamy, 59, and his wife, Lenora, 57, appeared to live the kind of private rural life that rarely attracted police attention. They maintained a small farm south of Bend, sold produce through local markets, paid their taxes, and had no criminal records. Local checks produced no complaints involving violence, missing people, or suspicious activity. That ordinary history made the investigation more difficult. Vance had no witness placing Bryn Holloway on the Bellamy property. There was no vehicle connected to the couple in the original 2001 case. Their names did not appear anywhere in the old Three Sisters Wilderness search records. Neither had an obvious connection to Oregon State University, the Holloway family, or Bryn's environmental studies. The only connection was geography. The Bellamy farm sat close to the route investigators believed Bryn had followed before reaching St. Charles Bend on August 23, 2006. Based on the scattered camera footage available closer to the city, her condition at the hospital, and the direction from which she had arrived, the property fell inside the corridor Vance considered possible. That was not enough to accuse anyone, but it was enough to keep looking. During surveillance, most activity around the property remained routine. The Bellamys managed their farm and appeared to follow predictable daily patterns. There were no unusual vehicles, no frequent visitors, and no obvious attempt to conceal anything from the outside world. One detail, however, continued to bother the investigators. A large storage building stood behind the main residence. For a rural property producing crops for sale, a structure of that size should have had some practical purpose. It might have held tools, equipment, supplies, feed, or seasonal materials. Yet during 3 full days of surveillance, neither Orson nor Lenora entered it. They used other parts of the property. They worked near it. They passed through areas immediately around it. But the building itself remained untouched. Vance knew that an unused farm building was not evidence of kidnapping. Plenty of rural properties contained barns or sheds that had outlived their original purpose. Some were simply storage spaces filled with equipment no one needed anymore. Still, Bryn Holloway's case had already demonstrated how dangerous ordinary explanations could become when accepted too quickly. For 5 years, everyone had believed a damaged backpack strap proved Bryn had died in the wilderness. Now she was alive. For 5 years, investigators had assumed there was no crime scene because they believed the wilderness itself had caused her disappearance. Now her injuries indicated years of deliberate control. The Bellamy property could be another innocent detail, or it could be the first place anyone had examined that belonged to the real story. Vance gathered the information his team had developed since Bryn's return. Her route toward Bend, the location of the property, its isolation, her physical condition, and the unexplained building were presented as part of the request for a search warrant. By the end of August 2006, authorization was granted. The search was organized to keep Orson and Lenora separated while officers examined the property. Investigators understood that if the couple had nothing to do with Bryn, the search might end quickly and leave them with another dead end. But if Bryn had been held there, 5 years of evidence might still exist somewhere on the land. The main residence did not immediately provide an answer. Attention shifted to the large storage building. The first unusual detail was the security. The building was locked more heavily than investigators expected for ordinary agricultural storage. That alone did not prove anything, but it reinforced the concern raised during surveillance. Once officers gained access, the interior initially seemed disappointing. There were old farming materials, equipment, and stored items consistent with a rural property. Nothing immediately identified the structure as a place connected to Bryn Holloway. The search continued systematically. Investigators checked walls, storage areas, flooring, and sections that appeared to have been altered or repaired over time. Near one portion of the floor, the surface did not match the surrounding area. The difference was subtle enough that it might have been ignored during a casual inspection. But this was no longer a casual inspection. Stored materials were removed from that section. Underneath them, officers discovered a concealed access panel built into the floor. The discovery changed the atmosphere of the search immediately. The opening did not lead to ordinary farm storage. It led underground. Below the building was a small enclosed room that had been reinforced and separated completely from normal living space. There were no windows. Ventilation was minimal. The room contained only the most basic items necessary to keep a person alive. a simple sleeping area, a bucket for sanitation, and a metal bowl. More important were the fixed points built into the structure. They were positioned in a way consistent with restraining a human being. The medical findings from St. Charles Bend suddenly had a physical location. The old marks around Bryn's wrists and ankles were no longer abstract evidence of something that might have happened somewhere. There was now a room where those injuries made sense. Investigators documented everything before disturbing the space further. The dimensions, the fixtures, the surfaces, and the placement of every object were recorded for forensic examination. Then they found the marks on one wall. There were hundreds, then more. Small repeated lines had accumulated over a large section of the surface, grouped in a pattern that suggested counting. The total was close to the number of days between Bryn's disappearance in July 2001 and her escape in August 2006. 5 years reduced to marks on a wall. For Vance, the behaviors Dr. Tamsin Keller had documented at the hospital now became almost impossible to separate from the room beneath the Bellamy property. Bryn preferred the floor because a normal bed had apparently not been part of her life. She waited before eating because access to food could have been controlled. She hesitated before using the restroom because even basic needs may once have required permission. She struggled with independent decisions because for years independence may have carried consequences. The underground room explained how someone could disappear only a limited distance from ordinary American communities and still remain completely beyond the reach of police, family, and search volunteers. Bryn had not needed to be hundreds of miles away. She had only needed to be hidden where no one thought to look. The discovery also destroyed the possibility that the Bellamys were simply unrelated property owners who happened to live along Bryn's escape route. Someone had designed this room. Someone had maintained it. Someone had kept another human being there long enough for thousands of days to be counted. Orson and Lenora Bellamy were separated while investigators continued processing the property. Neither was yet confronted with every detail discovered beneath the building. Vance wanted the physical evidence secured before interviews could shape or contaminate the investigation. The central mystery of Bryn's disappearance had finally changed. Police no longer needed to determine whether she had been held captive. They had found the place. But finding the room created a question that was even harder to understand. Orson and Lenora Bellamy had no criminal history, no known relationship with Bryn, and no obvious reason to target a 21-year-old graduate student they apparently did not know. If they had imprisoned her for 5 years, the crime could not be explained as a spontaneous act. There had to be a reason Bryn had ended up beneath their property. And somewhere inside the Bellamy home, investigators were about to discover that Bryn Holloway had not been chosen by accident. The discovery beneath the Bellamy storage building established where Bryn Holloway had been held, but it did not explain why she had been chosen. That answer emerged only after investigators expanded the search into the main house and began cataloging the Bellamy's personal records. What they found changed the case from a disturbing abduction into evidence of a carefully planned system. Behind a concealed section inside the Bellamy's bedroom, investigators located a small storage area containing notebooks, folders, archived photographs, and recording equipment. Much of the material had been organized by date. The oldest relevant entries reached back to early 2001, months before Bryn disappeared from the Three Sisters wilderness. Lenora Bellamy had kept detailed written records. The notes showed that she and Orson had spent months visiting hiking areas across Oregon, watching women who traveled alone. They recorded approximate ages, physical condition, routines, whether a person arrived with friends or family, and whether anyone appeared to be waiting for her return. They were not looking for an easy opportunity. They were selecting someone. Their preferred target was young, physically healthy, independent, and accustomed to spending time alone in remote areas. Most important, the person had to have a lifestyle that could make disappearance look accidental. A solo hiker fit that requirement almost perfectly. If a woman disappeared on a mountain trail, investigators would naturally begin with falls, exposure, navigational mistakes, sudden weather, or injury. Search teams would focus on the wilderness. Family members would assume the answer lay somewhere along the route. Every hour spent searching ravines and remote trail sections would move attention farther away from whoever had actually taken her. Bryn first appeared in the Bellamy's notes several months before July 2001. Her name was connected to observations made near hiking routes she used regularly. The records described her as young, experienced, physically capable, and comfortable traveling alone. Other details were added over time: her approximate schedule, the types of trails she preferred, the fact that she often began early enough to avoid larger groups, the frequency with which she returned to familiar areas. One detail appeared repeatedly in Lenora's notes. Bryn had a tendency to help other people. It was treated not as a virtue, but as a vulnerability. The Bellamys concluded that Bryn's willingness to respond when someone appeared to need assistance could be used to separate her from a public route without immediately creating suspicion. By June 2001, their records had shifted from observation to preparation. The underground room discovered by Vance's team had not been built after Bryn disappeared. It was already complete. The security points had been installed. The access had been concealed. The room had been prepared for long-term use before Bryn ever began her July 14th hike. That fact eliminated any remaining possibility that her imprisonment resulted from a spontaneous encounter. The Bellamys had planned for a captive before they had one. Other documents explained what they intended to do once a victim was inside. Orson had developed a set of beliefs centered on what he considered the failures of modern American society. His writings blamed individual freedom, changing family roles, technology, and social independence for what he described as the loss of proper order. Women who built careers, lived independently, or rejected traditional expectations became particular targets of his resentment. The documents did not present these ideas as private frustration. They presented them as justification. Orson believed some people could be removed from society and remade. Lenora's records showed that she did not merely tolerate those beliefs. She helped turn them into a practical system. Together, they called it the Renewal Program. The name suggested rehabilitation. The records described control. The goal was to strip a captive of ordinary independence until every basic decision depended on permission. Food could be controlled. Sleep could be controlled. Speech could be controlled. Even basic personal needs could become part of the system. The underground room had therefore served more than one purpose. It physically prevented Bryn from leaving, but the Bellamys also intended it to destroy her expectation that she had the right to make decisions for herself. The later notebooks documented the changes they believed they were producing. Early entries described Bryn as resistant and difficult to control. Later entries focused on smaller changes. She stopped attempting to speak unless permitted. She waited before eating. She became less likely to challenge instructions. She began requesting authorization for things she once would have done automatically. The language in the notebooks was detached and procedural, as though Lenora were recording the progress of a long experiment rather than the destruction of another person's independence. For Dr. Tamsin Keller, those records explained the behaviors she had observed at St. Charles Bend. Bryn's hesitation around food was not random. Her difficulty using the restroom without approval was not confusion. Her reluctance to speak freely was not simply silence caused by trauma. Those behaviors had been taught deliberately. The Bellamys had spent 5 years trying to make obedience feel safer than choice. Investigators also recovered video files associated with the underground room. The recordings confirmed that Bryn had been kept there for an extended period and that the Bellamys had monitored the effects of their system. A separate collection of images was even more important to the original disappearance. Those files showed Bryn before July 14, 2001. She had been photographed on hiking routes without knowing she was being watched. The Bellamys had documented her movements repeatedly, confirming the patterns written in Lenora's notes. For the first time, investigators could reconstruct the months leading to her disappearance from the perspective of the people responsible. Bryn had believed she was living an ordinary life. Orson and Lenora had been studying it. The evidence also resolved one of the oldest mysteries from the original search: the damaged strap from Bryn's backpack. For 5 years, That single piece of material had supported the conclusion that she suffered a fatal fall somewhere in the Three Sisters wilderness. The Bellamy's records showed otherwise. The strap had been placed deliberately to make the disappearance look like an accident. It had done exactly what they intended. Searchers concentrated on dangerous terrain. The Holloway family was gradually led toward the belief that Bryn had died. The case moved away from the possibility of a crime. The Bellamy's gained time. 5 years of it. The final entry connected the documents directly to Bryn's sudden appearance at St. Charles Bend. It was dated August 22, 2006, one day before she reached the hospital. According to Lenora's record, Orson had left the property for supplies when the underground access was not secured correctly. Bryn escaped. The Bellamys searched their property but avoided any response that might attract outside attention. They believed Bryn's physical condition made a successful escape unlikely. She had been deprived of normal nutrition for years and had little experience navigating the world outside the property after such prolonged isolation. Their assumption was simple. She could not get far. If she remained lost long enough, no one would ever connect her to them. They were wrong. Somewhere beneath 5 years of conditioning, Bryn still possessed enough of the woman she had once been to recognize one unguarded opportunity. She did not need a complete plan. She only needed to leave. The records also revealed one final fact that made the case even more urgent. Bryn was not supposed to be the end of the renewal program. She was the first. The Bellamys had already considered what would happen after her captivity reached what they called completion. Their writings indicated that another woman would eventually be selected using the same process. Another solo hiker. Another disappearance explained as misfortune. Another family searching in the wrong place. But on August 22, 2006, the system failed for the first time. Orson and Lenora Bellamy had spent 5 years trying to convince Bryn Holloway that she no longer had the right to choose anything for herself. When the opportunity finally came, Bryn made one choice they had never been able to remove from her completely. She chose to survive. By March 2007, the case against Orson and Lenora Bellamy had become one of the most closely examined criminal prosecutions in Oregon. What began in 2001 as the disappearance of a 21-year-old graduate student had been transformed by Bryn Holloway's return into something far more deliberate. Investigators were no longer trying to explain an accident in the Three Sisters wilderness. They were presenting evidence that two people had selected Bryn, studied her habits, removed her from her ordinary life, and kept her under systematic control for 5 years. The prosecution entered the trial with an unusually strong record. There were Lenora Bellamy's notebooks documenting the months before Bryn disappeared. There were photographs and recordings showing that Bryn had been watched during earlier hiking trips. There were files proving that the underground room had been prepared before July 14, 2001. Forensic evidence connected Bryn directly to that room, while the records recovered from the Bellamy property described how her access to food, sleep, speech, and basic personal decisions had been controlled over the years. The evidence also established that the damaged backpack strap discovered during the original search had not been the result of an accident. It had been used to support the false appearance that Bryn had fallen somewhere in the wilderness. Most important, Bryn herself was alive. Her testimony provided the part of the story no journal or recording could fully explain. Bryn described July 14, 2001 in fragments that investigators had spent months helping her organize into a reliable sequence. She had been hiking alone as planned when Lenora Bellamy approached her with a request for help. Lenora claimed that Orson was experiencing a problem nearby and needed assistance. For the Bellamys, the situation had been carefully calculated. For Bryn, it was an ordinary human decision. Someone appeared to need help, and Bryn responded. The same quality her family had always valued in her had been identified months earlier in the Bellamy surveillance notes as something they could exploit. Bryn remembered leaving the route because she believed another person might be in trouble. Her next clear memory was entirely different. She no longer knew where she was. She was inside an enclosed room beneath the Bellamy property, disconnected from the world she had known that morning. The first period of captivity was dominated by resistance. Bryn had spent her adult life making decisions for herself. She had managed college, research, travel, and difficult hikes independently. The Bellamys immediately attempted to replace that independence with a system in which nothing belonged to her. Not time, not food, not speech, not even the right to respond to basic needs without authorization. The rules were repeated until they became the structure of her life. She could not speak unless permitted. She could not eat simply because food was present. She could not decide when to sleep. She could not assume that needing something meant she was allowed to have it. Any resistance brought consequences designed to reinforce the same lesson. Independent choice would make conditions worse. The prosecution did not need Bryn to describe every day of the 5 years. The Bellamy's own files had already recorded much of the progression. The important part of her testimony was what those years had done to her understanding of normal life. At first, Bryn still measured her existence against the world outside. She remembered Oregon State University. She remembered her parents. She remembered Nolan. She remembered that people normally chose when to eat, sleep, speak, and leave a room. As months became years, that comparison became harder to maintain. The Bellamy system was not designed merely to keep her from escaping. It was intended to make escape psychologically less imaginable. Eventually, asking permission became safer than making a decision. Waiting became safer than acting. Silence became safer than speaking. The very behaviors Dr. Tamsin Keller had observed at St. Charles Bend were the final result of that process. The prosecution argued that this was exactly what Orson and Lenora intended. Orson's attorneys attempted to present his beliefs as evidence of serious psychological disturbance. They argued that his ideas about society, independence, and what he called renewal were so distorted that he genuinely believed he was correcting people rather than committing deliberate cruelty. The prosecution rejected that interpretation. A person acting without understanding, prosecutors argued, would not spend months selecting a victim according to specific criteria. He would not prepare a concealed room in advance, study a target's routines, choose a location where disappearance could be blamed on natural hazards, and create false evidence to misdirect a search. Orson's beliefs might have been extreme, but the planning showed awareness. Lenora's defense followed a different strategy. Her attorneys attempted to separate her from Orson's ideology and portray her as a wife who had lived under his influence for years. They argued that Orson had dominated the relationship and that Lenora's participation should be understood within that context. The notebooks made that defense difficult to sustain. Much of the detailed documentation had been written by Lenora. She had participated in observing potential victims before Bryn was selected. She had recorded Bryn's hiking patterns. She had helped evaluate why Bryn would be suitable. During the years of captivity, Lenora continued documenting changes in Bryn's behavior. Her records did not read like the writings of someone reluctantly witnessing a crime she opposed. They described progress, setbacks, compliance, and resistance as components of a shared project. The recordings recovered from the property reinforced the same conclusion. Lenora had not simply known what Orson was doing. She had participated. The jury therefore faced a case in which the defendant's own records supported nearly every major element of the prosecution's argument. The planning existed in writing. The surveillance existed in photographs. The captivity existed in forensic evidence. The psychological control existed both in the Bellamy's documents and in Bryn's condition after she escaped. The false accident theory from 2001 had also been dismantled. What had once appeared to be an unfortunate disappearance in a dangerous wilderness was now understood as part of the Bellamy's preparation. The jury rejected the central arguments offered by both defense teams. Orson Bellamy was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Lenora Bellamy also received a lengthy prison sentence, one severe enough that a realistic return to ordinary life outside prison became unlikely. For Celeste, Warren, and Nolan Holloway, the verdict finally provided something the 2001 search never had: an official account of what had happened to Bryn. The state no longer considered her a young woman lost to the wilderness. She had been targeted. She had been taken. She had been hidden. And she had survived. Legally, the case had reached its conclusion. The people responsible had been convicted. The underground room had been documented. The false story surrounding Bryn's disappearance had been replaced with the truth. But Dr. Keller understood that a courtroom could answer only one kind of question. Could decide guilt. Could impose punishment. Could establish facts. Could not return 5 years. Bryn left the legal process with something she had been denied since July 2001. Recognition that what had happened to her was real, deliberate, and wrong. Yet the habits formed beneath the Bellamy property remained. The door to the underground room had opened months earlier. The rules created inside it had not disappeared with the verdict. For Bryn Holloway, the criminal case was over. The much longer task of learning how to belong to herself again was only beginning. After the trial, Bryn Holloway returned to a life that was legally free but still governed by rules no one around her could see. Orson and Lenora Bellamy were in prison. The underground room had been secured as evidence. The property where Bryn had spent 5 years no longer controlled where she ate, slept, or spoke. Yet freedom did not immediately restore the instincts that captivity had taken from her. Bryn moved to a small apartment close to Celeste and Warren in Oregon. Living near her parents gave her support without requiring her to return to the family home or pretend that everything could become what it had been before July 2001. Dr. Tamsin Keller continued working with her, first through frequent appointments and later through a more gradual schedule as Bryn became medically and psychologically stable. The goals were deliberately small. No one asked Bryn to become the woman she had been at 21. No one asked her to return to Oregon State University. No one asked her to explain every part of the 5 missing years. Keller understood that recovery could not begin with expectations that belonged to another version of Bryn. It had to begin with ordinary choices. Eating when she was hungry, drinking when she was thirsty, sleeping in a bed because she wanted to, leaving one room for another without waiting for approval, deciding what clothes to wear, choosing whether to answer a question, saying no. For most adults, those decisions required almost no thought. For Bryn, each one challenged a system that had been reinforced for 5 years. During the first months after the trial, meals remained difficult. Bryn could understand that the food belonged to her and that no one had authority to deny it. Understanding that fact was different from trusting it. She sometimes waited after food was served, as though an instruction should follow. Even when she eventually began eating, there were moments when she still looked toward another person for confirmation. Celeste learned not to turn those moments into corrections. She did not repeatedly remind Bryn that she was free. Keller had explained that freedom could not simply be announced until Bryn believed it. Too much encouragement could become another form of pressure, another voice telling her what she was supposed to do. Instead, Celeste made food available and allowed Bryn to decide when to use it. Progress came slowly enough that someone outside the family might not have recognized it as progress at all. After roughly 3 months, Bryn was able to sleep in a bed for most of the night. There were still mornings when she discovered that she had moved to the floor without consciously deciding to do so. The behavior had been repeated for so many years that her body still treated the floor as a familiar place of safety. Keller did not treat those nights as failures. The important change was that Bryn could return to the bed because she chose to. 6 months brought another milestone. Bryn began eating without waiting for explicit permission. The change was not complete. She sometimes paused before the first bite. Sometimes her attention shifted toward whoever else was present, searching for approval that no longer needed to exist. But increasingly, the pause ended with Bryn making the decision herself. That distinction mattered. The Bellamys had trained her to believe that permission came from outside. Keller was helping her rebuild the belief that permission could come from herself. Other parts of daily life were more complicated. Male voices could still trigger immediate anxiety. Unexpected sounds could make ordinary environments feel unsafe. Situations in which Bryn did not know what would happen next were especially difficult because unpredictability had carried danger during captivity. Keller worked with her without pretending these reactions could simply be erased. Bryn had survived by learning patterns. For 5 years, recognizing the Bellamy's routines had helped her understand when food might come, when silence was safest, and when resistance would make conditions worse. Hyper-awareness had once protected her. Now the same habit made ordinary life exhausting. Recovery therefore required more than removing fear. Bryn had to learn that she no longer needed some of the skills that had kept her alive. Approximately a year after returning to her family, she reached another goal that seemed almost insignificant on paper. She could leave her apartment and walk a short distance through the neighborhood alone. There was no dramatic transformation attached to that achievement. Bryn did not suddenly become fearless afterward. She did not begin traveling freely or reclaim every part of her former independence. But she had gone somewhere because she decided to go. For Keller, that mattered more than distance. Nolan Holloway also had to learn how to be Bryn's brother again. Before 2001, their relationship had been built partly around humor. During Bryn's hiking trips, Nolan sent jokes whenever she updated him. Their final exchange before her disappearance had been ordinary enough that he spent years replaying it precisely because there had been no warning in it. After Bryn returned, Nolan initially wanted to recover that relationship. He wanted his sister to laugh at the things she once found funny. He wanted some recognizable piece of their old connection to confirm that 5 years had not taken everything. Eventually, he understood that asking for the old Bryn placed a burden on the woman who had survived. So he stopped measuring her against memory. He visited when he could travel from Seattle. He sometimes brought books Bryn had once enjoyed, but he never insisted she read them. He stayed nearby without demanding conversation. If Bryn wanted to speak, he listened. If she preferred silence, he accepted that too. For Warren, the adjustment was different. He had introduced Bryn to hiking when she was young. For years after her disappearance, he had believed the mountains had taken his daughter. When the truth emerged, even those memories changed. The places that had once represented shared family experiences were now connected to the method the Bellamys had used to select and isolate her. Warren eventually understood that Bryn's future could not be measured by whether she returned to those places. The family stopped treating the woman from 2001 as the destination. That became one of the most important changes in Bryn's recovery. For years, Celeste, Warren, and Nolan had grieved for the person they believed had died. When Bryn returned alive, they had to confront a more complicated truth. Loving her could not mean waiting for the exact person they remembered to return. 5 years could not be removed from her life. The habits formed during captivity could not be erased because a judge sentenced the Bellamys. The graduate student who once traveled alone through Oregon's wilderness had entered that underground room at 21. The woman who escaped was 26 and had spent nearly 1/5 of her life under someone else's control. Her family could not give those years back. What they could give her was something different. Time without demands. Choices without consequences. Presence without conditions. Bryn's progress remained uneven. Some days she could make decisions that had seemed impossible months earlier. On other days, old rules returned with surprising force. Keller reminded the family that recovery did not follow a straight line and that independence could not be rebuilt through pressure. The important fact was that Bryn was beginning to make choices again. Small choices at first, then slightly larger ones. For the first time since July 2001, her life was no longer organized around what Orson and Lenora Bellamy allowed. It was slowly becoming organized around what Bryn Holloway wanted. Her family finally understood that they had not been given the Bryn they lost 5 years earlier. They had been given the chance to know the woman who survived. And instead of asking her to return to the past, they began helping her build a future that belonged entirely to her. Bryn Holloway survived. That fact became the center of everything that followed, but survival was not a clean ending. It was not a moment when the past suddenly lost its power. By the time Orson and Lenora Bellamy were convicted in 2007, Bryn had already begun the much slower work of learning how to live outside the system they had built around her for 5 years. The Bellamys had controlled nearly every part of her existence. They had decided when she could eat, when she could sleep, when she could speak, and when she could attend to the most basic needs of her own body. They had tried to convince her that choice itself was dangerous. For years, that system had worked. But on August 22, 2006, one mistake changed everything. The underground access was not secured correctly while Orson was away from the property. For the first time in years, Bryn had an opportunity that did not depend on permission. She could have waited. The habits created by captivity gave her every reason to wait. She had been conditioned to believe that acting without authorization would bring consequences. She had been taught that the safest decision was often no decision at all. Yet something deeper survived beneath those rules. Bryn left. She had no detailed plan, no reliable understanding of how far she was from help, and no certainty that she could reach anyone before the Bellamys found her. 5 years of isolation had separated her from the ordinary world. Her physical condition made every mile difficult, and the life she had known before 2001 had become almost impossibly distant. Still, she chose a direction away from the property. Then she continued. That choice eventually carried her to St. Charles Bend and returned her name to a family that had spent years believing she was dead. In the months after the trial, Dr. Tamsin Keller often returned to that fact when working with Bryn. The point was not to turn the escape into a heroic story that Bryn was required to celebrate. Keller understood that survivors should not be forced to make suffering inspirational for other people. The importance was simpler. The Bellamys had failed to remove Bryn's ability to choose completely. They had damaged it. They had buried it beneath years of fear and conditioning. But they had not destroyed it. That became the foundation of Bryn's recovery. She did not suddenly return to the person she had been at 21. The environmental science student who once traveled confidently through Oregon's mountains belonged to a chapter of her life that could not simply be reopened. For a long time, Bryn struggled with situations that once would have seemed insignificant. Unexpected sounds remained difficult. Some male voices still created immediate fear. Unfamiliar places could feel overwhelming. Choices that other adults made automatically sometimes required long consideration. And the mountains themselves carried a meaning they had never carried before. Before July 2001, hiking had represented independence. It had connected Bryn to her childhood, her father, her academic work, and her own confidence. After her return, those same places were connected to the method the Bellamys had used to study and select her. No one in the Holloway family asked her to go back. Warren understood this perhaps more painfully than anyone. He had introduced his daughter to hiking when she was young. For years after her disappearance, he believed the wilderness had killed her. When the truth emerged, he had to accept that the mountains themselves had never betrayed Bryn. People had. Even so, Bryn did not owe anyone a return to the trails simply to prove that she had recovered. Dr. Keller never used hiking as a measure of progress. Celeste never treated a return to college as a requirement. Nolan never expected his sister to become the same person who used to send him casual updates from mountain trails. The family gradually learned that healing could not be defined by how closely Bryn resembled her former self. That understanding changed the way they supported her. They stopped asking what parts of the old Bryn could be restored. Instead, they paid attention to what the present Bryn wanted. Sometimes that meant something as ordinary as choosing what to eat. Sometimes it meant deciding not to attend a gathering. Sometimes it meant spending time with Nolan without talking about the missing years. Sometimes it meant changing plans because the situation felt unsafe. The value of those decisions came from one thing. They belonged to her. For years, Orson and Lenora had tried to convince Bryn that another person should control the terms of her existence. Every independent decision she made after returning challenged that lesson. She chose when to eat. She chose when to rest. She chose whether to speak. She chose who could enter her life. She chose when she needed help. She even learned that asking for help was different from asking for permission. That distinction took time. Permission meant someone else possessed authority over her. Help meant the decision remained hers. The difference was small in language but enormous in meaning. As the years of recovery began to accumulate, Bryn's progress remained uneven. There were still difficult days. There were still moments when old rules returned before rational thought could stop them. Some reactions became less intense, while others remained part of her life. There was no single morning when she woke up completely free of the past. That was not what healing looked like. Healing was repetition. It was choosing again after fear returned. It was recognizing that a setback did not erase previous progress. It was understanding that survival did not create an obligation to be grateful every day. Most importantly, it was accepting that she did not need to become the Bryn Holloway of July 13, 2001 in order for her life to have value. 5 years had changed her. Nothing could make that untrue. But change did not mean the Bellamys had won. They had believed identity was something they could erase and replace through enough isolation and control. They believed a person could be reduced to obedience if every independent choice was punished long enough. Bryn's life after captivity proved the flaw in that belief. The part of her that survived was not necessarily the confident graduate student who once walked alone through the Cascades. It was something more basic, a belief, however faint, that her life still belonged to her. That belief had carried her away from the Bellamy property in August 2006, carried her through the hospital, carried her through the trial, and afterward, it appeared in thousands of ordinary decisions that no newspaper would ever report. There was no dramatic final victory. There was simply a woman gradually becoming the author of her own life again. Celeste, Warren, and Nolan eventually understood that this was enough. They could mourn the years Bryn had lost without mourning the woman standing before them. They could remember who she had been without demanding that she return. They could love the survivor without turning survival into the only thing that defined her. Bryn had entered Three Sisters Wilderness in 2001 believing that freedom meant being able to go wherever she wanted. After everything that followed, freedom came to mean something quieter and far more fundamental. It meant knowing that her next decision belonged to her. The Bellamys had stolen 5 years. They had changed memories, relationships, habits, and dreams. But they had not been given ownership of everything that came afterward. And perhaps that is where the deepest meaning of Bryn Holloway's story remained. A person does not have to return unchanged from suffering in order to have survived it with dignity. Healing does not always restore what was lost. And freedom does not erase what happened behind a locked door. Sometimes recovery is simply the slow return of choice. The right to decide what comes next. The right to become someone new without apologizing for no longer being who you were. And the right to understand that even after another person has taken years from your life, the years that remain can still belong entirely to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your presence, your attention, and your willingness to stay with this journey until the end truly mean more than words can express. Bryn's story reminds us that survival is not always about returning to the person we once were. Sometimes, surviving means accepting that life has changed us, while still believing that the future can belong to us again. Healing does not happen all at once, and freedom is not simply the moment a door opens. Real freedom can begin with the smallest choices. Deciding what we want, learning to trust ourselves again, and understanding that our lives should never belong to someone else. This story also reminds us to value compassion without taking it for granted, to pay attention to people who may be suffering silently, and to never underestimate the strength that can remain inside a person even after years of hardship. We may not be able to change what has already happened, but we can still choose what we do with the days ahead. If today's story touched you, inspired you, or gave you something to think about, you can support our channel in a very simple way. Please give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you again for listening, for caring, and for being part of this community. We truly appreciate every one of you.